Okay, we are talking about Christianity in colonial America prior to 1700. We considered briefly the Catholic influence, primarily through Spanish missions, and then the small Catholic presence in um, Maryland. Then we have turned to English colonization and looked at the role of the Church of England in Virginia and the South. Now we want to turn to the Puritan experience in New England. All right, you know already that the Puritans were a group in England who didn't think that the Church of England was Protestant enough. They wanted to purify the Church of England, drawing it closer to their vision of an appropriately Protestant church. The Puritan migration to North America began in earnest when reforms in the Church of England seemed to be cut off, and they didn't feel like there was any opportunity really to purify the Church of England. This occurred after the ascension of Charles I to the English throne in 1625. Charles believed in the divine right of kings. He sought to reduce the authority of the English Parliament. He married a Roman Catholic, and generally he supported what might be called high Anglican policies in the Church of England. That is to say, a version of the Church of England closer to Catholicism than to a pure form of Protestantism. Uh, um, so all that to say, he wasn't going to reverse the policy of an independent Church of England, independent from the Vatican in Rome. But he certainly sought a Church of England not very different from the Roman Catholic Church. And in the 30 Years' War on the continent, where Protestant kings were fighting Catholic kings, he didn't support Protestant monarchs. All of this to the dismay of the Puritans, and therefore leading them to the conclusion that it was time to seek another place to create a pure church. It's sometimes said that the Puritans came to America in search of religious liberty. That's not true at all, if by that is meant that they came to create a society in which there was religious liberty, in which everyone was free to practice their religion as they saw fit. Rather, they came to escape their own oppression in England, and they came for the freedom to embody their particular version of Christianity the way they saw fit without interference. So they sought the freedom to create a Puritan Christian world. The first colony, which arrived in 1620, actually before Charles I, was a more radical separatist Puritan group that had long despaired of reform. The Massachusetts colony, 8 years later, 1628, was a much more moderate mainstream group of Puritans who actually only came to the conclusion that it was time to leave after Charles I came to the throne. The Massachusetts Bay Colony was much stronger and eventually absorbed the Plymouth colony of separatist Puritans. Let's consider the main Puritan convictions. First, they insisted that salvation depends entirely upon God. Now, in this, they were consistent with the overall Protestant theme of salvation by grace through faith, as opposed to works righteousness, salvation as a gift of God's grace. But as Calvinists, the Puritans went to the extreme in emphasizing that even our conversion or our faith is the work of God in us, that it's not a choice that we make, but it's rather the work of God in us. So Calvinists are famous for this idea of predestination, which is not simply the idea that everything that happens is foreordained by God. It's specifically the idea that who is saved and who is damned is preordained by God. That way, that doctrine, that idea, reflects their concern to say that salvation is entirely God's work. They didn't believe that human beings had a free will that enabled us to choose for ourselves whether to embrace Christianity or not. They believed that those who embraced Christianity were those who had been foreordained by God and in whom God worked to give Christian faith. Secondly, they emphasized the supreme authority of the Bible, but in this they are just solidly within the Protestant tradition in that emphasis on the authority of the Bible rather than the authority of Christian tradition or of bishops and the Pope in interpreting that tradition. They believed in a Presbyterian or congregational form of church organization, which is to say that they rejected the Roman Catholic idea that authority flows downward from the Pope through the bishops to the local priest. That's called an episcopal polity or an episcopal bishop-based form of church organization. And you'll recall the Church of England didn't deviate from that Roman Catholic model. That's a part of the reason the Puritans are so upset about the Church of England. For the Puritans, authority in the church resides with the local congregation and its redeemed male members. Some accepted the idea of a measure of authority for something called a presbytery, which would be a regional authority of representatives elected from local congregations. But some didn't acknowledge any authority beyond the authority of the local congregation. Those would be Congregationalists as opposed to Presbyterian. Fourth, the Puritans saw society as a unified whole. The purpose of true religion or of valid Christianity is not simply individual, but also social holiness, social reform. And consistent with this idea of society as a unified whole, the state or the government is seen as an arm of God's providence for serving religious or spiritual aims. Now, Mark Knoll, a historian of American Christianity, says, look, the Puritans were not theocratic in the sense that governing officials weren't ordained people or weren't church officials. They weren't the same group, let's say, like in current Iran, where the Ayatollah, the head of the Iranian community, is the head of state. The Puritans distinguished religious and political authority, but they clearly recognized or believed that political authority existed to serve religious aims. Finally, a distinctive Protestant idea, Puritan idea, was the idea that God works through covenants. When one comes to faith, one forms a personal covenant with God. A local church is what happens when a group of individuals covenant together to worship together and educate their children together. But they also believed in national covenants, in the possibility that God made a covenant with England, as we saw Halkut emphasized, or that God could make a covenant with the whole, eventually, of America. We will read much more about this idea when we get into Richard Hughes's book on myths America lives by. So the Puritans come to America seeking an opportunity to embody their distinctive Calvinist Protestant version of Christianity, free from the interference of the English authorities in the Church of England. The leader of their colony was a man named John Winthrop. Winthrop is famous, among other things, for an expression he used in addressing the Puritans as they journeyed to America. He said that they were to be a city set upon a hill. And by that he meant that he thought all of the European Protestant world was looking to them to be a model of what God wanted in a Christian church and a Christian society. When they got to the United States, or when they got to Massachusetts, was not yet the United States, they put in practice a form of religion that put great emphasis on the individual conversion experience. Now, you remember, Calvinists insist that God initiated conversion. They believe in predestination, that is, that God has chosen the elect from before all time. It's God's choice, God's election, not yours, that makes one a true Christian. But the Puritans were not satisfied with mere belief and conformity as evidence that a person was among the elect, nor were they satisfied with any outward display of Christianity as that representing true reform. They insisted that only a powerful experience of rebirth or conversion was evidence of one's being among the elect. One had to publicly display or testify to evidence of such conversion to be a church member and to be a part of a local church covenant. Secondly, they, in their colony, they limited political enfranchisement, the right to vote, political power, to converted males. Only those males who were a part of a local church covenant could exercise political power by voting or holding office. Moreover, they believed, as we know, in independent local congregations. They were not Presbyterians, they were Congregationalists. And for both these reasons, let's say the political rights, voting rights for all converted males, and for this emphasis on local authority, the Puritans are seen as an important influences moving what will become the United States in the direction of a democratic form of government, in which political power is dispersed among the people, and it's local. It bubbles up from below to those at the top. Now, they may seem undemocratic to us in their complete disregard for religious liberty, their exclusion of the vote to only converted Christian men, but in their context, these ideas were democratic. Puritans insisted on weekly worship, at the center of which was the sermon, not the Eucharist, not the Lord's Supper, as in the Roman Catholic or the Church of England or the Lutheran versions of Christianity. And the Puritans were learned preachers that delivered long, didactic, instructive sermons intended to form the lives of their people. Maybe it's because of the importance of the sermon that they valued education. They had valued an educated clergy and laity who could read the Bible and interpret it and apply it intelligently. If you think about this, if you depend upon the Bible and on a sermon delivered by a local minister with responsibility for the spiritual status of the congregation, that minister had better be highly literate and educated to be able to understand the word and interpret it to his people. Well, I think it's fair to say that the Puritan dream, the Puritan ideal, failed, and it failed very quickly. Theirs was a strenuous effort on the part of those first generation Puritans to create a perfect, unified Puritan Christian society in New England, but it failed. Their ideal required a congregation in which at least the vast majority, if not everyone, was a truly converted, covenanted member. It required acceptance by all of the authority of those Puritan male converts, their authority to enforce the Puritan Christian understanding of morality. But things fell apart at that very core, at this ideal of a congregation of converted individuals. The problem was that the first generation of Puritans died out, and their children and grandchildren were, according to the complaints of many Puritan preachers, far less pious and dedicated. Indeed, they were criticized for being more concerned about material things than spiritual ones. Many second and third generation Puritans and new immigrants didn't experience conversion. And since they were not experiencing conversion, they could not be a part of a local congregation exercising political authority. Full membership, you remember, and voting rights, and the right to have one's children baptized required that conversion experience, but fewer and fewer were having it. Thus, fewer and fewer children were being baptized into the church. Thus, the church was losing its influence over people. So, as a solution, Reverend Solomon Stoddard proposed what he called a halfway covenant, or a kind of partial church membership, whereby those who accepted Christian beliefs and lived a relatively moral life could have their children baptized, even if they had never actually had a conversion experience. Those partial members, though, could not themselves receive communion. Now, the hope was for this halfway covenant would be that the church, the congregation, could maintain some kind of authority in the community, could maintain influence over folks. But you can see it's a weakening of their idea of what a church should be. Another problem was that the English political authorities who granted the charters for colonial governments, were more interested in a viable colony, an economically viable colony, a sustainable colony, than they were the realization of the Puritan ideal. They wanted to attract colonists to Massachusetts, whether or not they were Puritans. So the Massachusetts Charter was actually revoked in 1691, and a new one that recognized the king's authority over the local community rather than the authority of the congregations, and extended voting rights in the colony to all male property holders, whether or not they were Puritans, surely whether or not they had been converted. So no longer were only born again Puritan Christians holders of monopoly political power. And of course, many non Christians came to Massachusetts. Some were Church of England loyalists, some were Quakers, some were even more radical separatist Puritans or even Baptists. Roger Williams, for example, thought the Puritans not rigorous enough, and he objected to their seizure of land from the native populations, thinking that they actually held their domain illegally and immorally. And he was banished from Massachusetts and fled to what became Rhode Island, and eventually became convinced that there should be no uniting of civil authority and religious authority, that a true conversion could not be coerced, and therefore he is one of the architects of this of an idea that becomes associated with the Baptist communities with which he affiliates, of a complete and radical separation of church and state, because religious belief can't be coerced, Williams insisted. Another sign of trouble for the New England way is represented in the experience of Anne Hutchinson. There's a great deal about Anne Hutchinson in the film that we'll be watching called God in America. But the idea is here was this woman who came to Massachusetts and began interpreting the weekly sermon, holding a meeting in her house where she interpreted that sermon. And she so radically emphasized, it seemed to the Puritans, faith and conversion, but not the responsibility of living a moral life, that she was accused of antinomianism, that is to say, being against the law or against moral order. But what finally got her in trouble was her claim that she was receiving direct communication and inspiration from God. And as a result of that, she was banished from the New England Puritan colony and actually died in an Indian uprising in New York. Now, Anne Hutchinson represents just the difficulty that very early on the Puritans had in maintaining their authority, their strict control over their own population. The Salem witch trials, another blot on the Puritan experience, in which hysteria arose with reference to some women in the community, and eventually 150 people were imprisoned and 19 women executed as witches. Kester makes the comment that the Salem witch trials served to discredit the Puritan leadership. Others have said it represents it's a symbol of people's vulnerability to mass suggestion and scapegoating. And so when this idea became rampant that the devil was at work among the women of Salem, the devil was at work in the Puritan colony, and surely the women were the scapegoats for that. All that did not serve the long-term interests of the Puritan experiment very well. Many folks believe that despite the failure of the Puritan experience, in fact, the Puritans have had a great influence on American history, much far beyond the success of their religious ideal. Many point to this idea of theirs of a national covenant with God as the origin or the basis for what some have called the American civil religion. As I said, we're going to read a great deal about this in the book by Richard Hughes called Myths America Lives By. But deep in American history is this idea that somehow we have a unique relationship to God, a unique set of historic responsibilities. The contemporary expression that's used for this is called American exceptionalism, but many see that as rooted in Winthrop's idea of the Puritans as a city set upon a hill, and that idea of God making a covenant with a people or even a nation for some particular purpose. Another great influence of the Puritans that people have pointed to is their moral strenuousness, their seriousness in reforming society and reforming individual morality and the society as something that has never disappeared in American culture. The United States has always been a place that has emphasized self-improvement and always looking to reform society, to make it more pure, more just, and that many say is a Puritan characteristic. We've already talked a bit about their influence on democracy, their idea that political authority resides now, as we've said, with only men and only converted men, but still that distribution of authority downward to people in the local congregation is a very democratizing impact that they had. And then finally, some would say the important place that education played very early on and throughout American history can be attributed in part to the Puritans who founded Harvard. Now, I would point out that the Church of England in Virginia very quickly established William and Mary. So I'm not sure that this emphasis on education is strictly a Puritan thing, but surely it's something those English settlers brought to America with them that had an influence on us. Okay, hopefully for those of you who were unable to be in class last week, this helps to sort of catch you up, at least in a general way, with the material we covered last week in class.